Hi, the book I'm reviewing today is called Grit by Angela Duckworth. Why Passion and Resilience Are the Secrets to Success. I actually watched her TEDx talk on grit. If you haven't watched it, go and check it on YouTube. You'll find it. I found it really informative. And the nuggets that she shared, I thought, you know what, this book, let me get it and see. And it was very fascinating. It has been a New York Times bestseller, and after reading this, you'll definitely understand why. She covers so many topics that I think are so relevant in today that we think about, and maybe we don't know how to define it. Things like failure and how do we, as individuals, as a collective, as a society, as within our jobs or anywhere else, look at failure. How do we attribute success, and we also look at the impact that it has, right? And how we treat people who are either going through failure, and how we treat people who are successful, not realizing that failure has been a stepping stone to that. She unpacks items such as complaining, something that all of us engage in, and the effect that it has, and how does grit play into complaining, something I'd never thought that there would be a correlation on. She looks at talking about culture, and the impact that grit has on how we build culture, and how culture then translates to how we achieve things. She talks about courage, right? And why grittier people are more courageous. And again, that's a correlation that we don't look at. We just look at courage and assume, he or she is just someone courageous. She talks about leadership and teamwork, and she has a whole chapter dedicated to parenting with grit. Being a parent myself, it was really quite eye-opening. There are sometimes some certain nuances that we parent with that has been inbred to us, and we don't think of its impact, right? Or we look at parenting of others and we're judgmental. And we don't understand context in all of this. She talks about being fierce, and I really enjoyed that, because you think of someone being fierce as something innate, or something that sometimes is frowned upon. She covers that. This book talks about it. She talks about competing. Just automatically, when we use the word competing, we associate the negative with it. But is competing really negative? Why is it? How should we be viewing it? She covers items such as overcoming adversity as well, which is quite enlightening. There aren't many people or many books that I've read that cover it quite as profoundly as she has managed to. And I know I've covered that she speaks about failure, but something, again, I want to come back to is we all know how to succeed, but do we know how to fail? Do we know how that feels? How do we help those going through it? And you know, what's really stood out is we want to study and look at successful people. Do we unearth how much of failure they actually go through to get to that point? She talks about mindset, something that I've been very deliberate about these past few months, and I've seen the importance of having the right mindset. She covers that as well, a mindset that allows you to succeed through grit. She has a whole chapter dedicated to hope. Hope and grit, you think, do they go? Most definitely. And purpose, and do we know what it is that our calling is? And passion, right? Feedback, we all want feedback, but when it's negative or criticism or constructive feedback as well, do we know how to receive it? Do we know the importance of it? And another topic she covers that I think that's quite relevant is how we all get distracted by talent. I think that's something we can all attest to. We all talk about talent, but how much do we cover about how distracted we get by talent? Is talent sufficient to achieve? I'm going to read some extracts that really stood out and then cover some of the topics that I've highlighted already. How often do people start down a path and then give up on it entirely? How many treadmills, exercise bikes, and weight sets are at this very moment gathering dust in basements across the country? How many kids go out for a sport and then quit even before the season is over? How many of us vow to knit sweaters for all our friends but only manage half a sleeve before putting down the needles? Ditto for home vegetable gardens, compost bins, and diets. How many of us start something new, full of excitement and good intentions, and then give up permanently when we encounter the first real obstacle, the first long plateau in progress? Many of us, it seems, quit what we start far too early and far too often. Even more than the effort a gritty person puts in on a single day, what matters is that they wake up the next day and the next, ready to get on that treadmill and keep going. The separation of talent and skill, Will Smith points out, is one of the greatest misunderstood concepts for people who are trying to excel, who have dreams, who want to do things. Talent you have naturally. Skill is only developed by hours and hours and hours of beating on your craft. And that's something I think in today's times of fast foods, fast fashion, access to everything fast, quick now at our fingertips, we forget the difference of talent and skill, and that was quite profound, right? I'm gonna say it again. Skill is only developed by hours and hours and hours of beating on your craft. Are you willing to put in those hours? How gritty are you? I was impressed and said so. But I hasten to add that grit is more about stamina than intensity. So if you're working on that project with the same energy in a year or two, email me. I can say more about your grit then. He was puzzled. Well, I might not be working on the same thing in a few years. Good point. Lots of ventures that seem promising at the start turn out badly. Lots of optimistic business plans end up in the discard bin. Okay, so maybe this particular startup won't be what you're working on. But if you're not working in the same industry, if you're on to some totally unrelated pursuit, then I'm not sure your story illustrates grit. You mean stay in one company? He asked. Not necessarily, but skipping around from one kind of pursuit to another, from one skill set to an entirely different one. That's not what gritty people do. But what if I move around a lot? And while I'm doing that, I'm working incredibly hard. Grit isn't just working incredibly hard. That's only part of it. Pause. Why? Well, for one thing, there are no shortcuts to excellence. Developing real expertise, figuring out really hard problems, it all takes time, longer than most people imagine. And then you've got to apply those skills and produce goods or services that are valuable to people. Rome wasn't built in a day. He was listening, so I continued. And here's the really important thing. Grit is about working on something you care about so much that you're willing to stay loyal to it. It's doing what you love, I get that, right? It's doing what you love, but not just falling in love, staying in love. Another extract from a chapter called Practice. A vivid, if somewhat melodramatic, first-hand description of what deliberate practice can feel like comes from dancer Martha Graham. Dancing appears glamorous, easy, delightful, but the path to the paradise of that achievement is not easier than any other. There is fatigue so great that the body cries even in its sleep. There are times of complete frustration. There are daily small deaths. And I'm going to pause a bit on that. I was actually having a conversation with someone about that very concept, right? And the dancer and Angela covered it very beautifully in their book. for anything new to be born, or for us to be able to achieve anything else, we need to have those daily small debts. But how many of us actually are aware of it or even discuss it? And it's critical to being successful and to being gritty. To continue on this topic, nobody wants to show you the hours and hours of becoming. They'd rather show you the highlight of what they've become. And isn't that what we're taught these days, right? Let's just highlight everything. It's a summary. But the real work happens in those hours and hours of becoming, and she captured that absolutely beautifully. Lately, I've been asking gritty performers and their coaches in diverse fields to elaborate on how it feels to do deliberate practice. Many agree with dancer Martha Graham that attempting to do what you cannot yet do is frustrating, uncomfortable, and even painful. And that was the extract I read to you. Still on practice, Elena Bodrova and Deborah Leong, psychologists who've devoted their careers to studying how children learn, agree that learning from mistakes is something babies and toddlers don't mind at all. Watch a baby struggle to sit up or a toddler learning to walk. You'll see one error after another, failure after failure, a lot of challenge exceeding skill, a lot of concentration, a lot of feedback, and a lot of learning. Emotionally, well, they're too young to ask, but very young children don't seem tortured while they're trying to do things they can't yet do. And then something changes, according to Elena and Deborah. Around the time children enter kindergarten, they begin to notice that their mistakes inspire certain reactions in grown-ups. What do? We frown, our cheeks flush a little. We rush over to our little ones to point out what they've done something wrong. And what's the lesson we're teaching? Embarrassment, fear, and shame. Coach Bruce Jamel says that's exactly what happens to many of his swimmers. Between coaches and parents and friends and the media, they've learned that failing is bad, so they protect themselves and won't stick their neck out and give their best effort. Shame doesn't help you fix anything, Deborah told me. So what's to be done? Whether you can make deliberate practice as ecstatic as flow, I don't know, but I do think you can try saying to yourself and to others, that was hard, it was great. And I think this is something that we can all help and support each other, right? Because we do teach the fear and the shame, and failing and learning something new, we are obviously going to make many mistakes. So we should change that in terms of how we react to others in this space. And let's get into the habit of highlighting what we're doing good and not only the mistakes that we do. There's a chapter she has on purpose. This is extracts from there. Now in her late 50s, Jane continues to work from early morning to late in the evening, 6 or 7 days a week. One colleague likens working with her to running a campaign office the night before an election, except election day never comes. I found this quite profound and a beautiful way to highlight that when you're pursuing your purpose with passion, it exactly feels like how they've summarized here. And another one on purpose that I think you'll find quite enlightening. 3 bricklayers are asked, what are you doing? The first says, I am laying bricks. The second says, I am building a church. And the third says, I am building the house of God. The first bricklayer has a job. The second has a career. The third has a calling. Many of us would like to be like the third bricklayer, but instead identify with the first or second. Yale management professor Amy Wisniewski has found that people have no trouble at all telling her which of the 3 bricklayers they identify with. In about equal numbers, workers identify themselves as having a job. I view my job as just a necessity of life, more like breathing or sleeping. a career. I view my job primarily as a stepping stone to other jobs or a calling. My work is one of the most important things in my life. I want us to be mindful. I want you to be mindful in terms of how you answer on this. And which one do you relate to, the first, second, or third bricklayer? And that will help to highlight if it's just doing a job, do you have a career, or are you following your calling? An extract from her chapter on parenting. Okay, Steve said. All right. Everything is contextual, right? I listened. The context was that my dad knew me. He knew all I wanted to do was sprint home, and he knew that if he let me do that, he would be letting me give into my fears. It was a loving act, Steve concluded. It was tough, but it was loving. And when you read this book, you'll understand the context. But here it was about tough parenting, and Steve became a very successful athlete. And everyone commented about what a tough dad he had, because his father never let him come back home. His dad never allowed him to give up. And that was Steve giving context to this tough love scenario, and that his dad knew him, and he knew that he had to be strong for him. Otherwise, Steve would have given up and not been able to achieve the success that he did. And a self-reflection point here for all of us is, how many of us judge so much those parents who are tough without understanding the context in terms of their parenting style and their knowledge of knowing who their kids are. Also from her parenting chapter, the thought of an office job was about as horrible as fate as Francesca could imagine. She asked her parents what she should do. Go and follow your dreams, Alex told his daughter, and if they don't work out, then you can reassess. I asked Alex about his follow your dream advice. Before explaining, he reminded me that Francesca's brother Raul was also allowed to drop out of high school to apprentice himself to a renowned portrait painter. We never put pressure on either of them to become doctors or lawyers or anything like that. I truly believe that when you do something you really want to do, it becomes a vocation. Francesca and her brother are incredibly hard workers, but they feel passionately about their subjects, so to them it's not at all oppressive. An extract from her chapter on the playing fields of grit. His major conclusion was simply that the association between working hard and reward can be learned. Bob will go further and say that without directly experiencing the connection between effort and reward, animals, whether they're rats or people, default to laziness. Calorie-burning effort is, after all, something evolution has shaped us to avoid whenever possible. And this really caught my attention, and I'm going to repeat that part. That where we as humans don't directly experience the connection between effort and reward, we will naturally default to laziness. An extract from her chapter on culture. I left out the most important thing, Dan said. The real way to become a great swimmer is to join a great team. That logic might strike you as strange. You might assume that first a person becomes a great swimmer and then he or she joins a great team. And it's true, of course, that great teams don't take just anyone. There are tryouts. There are limited number of spots. There are standards. And the more elite the team, the fiercer the desire of those already on the team to keep those standards high. And I found this quite fascinating because just as he was mentioning, I did find that logic quite strange, right? We always think first we become great and then we join a team. But there is that saying of you are the sum of the 5 most people you hang out with. You know, we absorb that, and joining a great team or a team that is grittier will make sure that you are too. So it seems to me, Dan concluded, that there's a hard way to get grit and an easy way. The hard way is to do it by yourself. The easy way is to use conformity, the basic human drive to fit in, because if you're around a lot of people who are gritty, you're going to act grittier too. We're still on culture. You have to learn to get over bumps in the road and mistakes and setbacks, he told me when I talked about the culture he's built at JP Morgan Chase. Failures are going to happen, and how you deal with them may be the most important thing in whether you succeed. You need fierce resolve. You need to take responsibility. You call it grit. I call it fortitude. Fortitude is to Jamie Dimon what sisu is to Finland. Jamie recalls that getting fired from Citibank at age 33 and then taking a full year to ponder what lessons to take from this episode made him a better leader. And that was quite profound, right? Because things happen and often we can just sit and complain about it. But do we sit back and reflect and absorb about what we can learn from it? And this again was very profound. I was actually having a conversation with someone else and he was talking about this very point. What do we learn? I mean, and here in this, Jamie was talking, right, about him being fired from Citibank, and it took him a year to work through this, but he bounced back, and what he built at JP Morgan Chase was nothing short of amazing. Still on culture. Talent is common. What you invest to develop that talent is the critical final measure of greatness. Many of Anson's admirers attribute his unprecedented success to recruitment. That's simply incorrect, he told me. We're out-recruited by 5 or 6 schools on a regular basis. Our extraordinary success is about what we do once the players get here. It's our culture. I'm in her chapter on culture, and because I think it was quite important, I'm going to cover what she talks about in terms of competing, and once you read the book you'll have more context. Compete, I'm told, it's not what I think it is. It's not about triumphing over others, a notion I've always been uneasy about. Compete means excellence. Compete comes from the Latin, explains Mike Javaris, the competitive surfer turned sports psychologist who is one of Pete's partners in culture building. Quite literally, it means strive together. It doesn't have anything in its origins about another person losing. Mike tells me that 2 key factors promote excellence in individuals and in teams: deep and rich support and relentless challenge to improve. When he says that, a light bulb goes on in my head. Supportive and demanding parenting is psychologically wise and encourages children to emulate their parents. It stands to reason that supportive and demanding leadership would do the same. I begin to get it. For this professional football team, it's not solely about defeating other teams. It's about pushing beyond what you can do today so that tomorrow you're just a little bit better. It's about excellence. So for the Seahawks, always compete means be all you can be, whatever that is for you. Reach for your best. And the last extract on culture that I'm going to read to you is this. At the end of the day, I'm in the lobby waiting for my taxi. Pete is there with me, making sure I get off okay. I realize I haven't asked him directly how he and the Seahawks found the courage to continue after he'd made the worst call ever. Pete later told Sports Illustrated that it wasn't the worst decision, it was the worst possible outcome. He explained that like every other negative experience and every positive one, it becomes part of you. I'm not going to ignore it, I'm going to face it. And when it bubbles up, I'm going to think about it and get on with it and use it. use it. And this was really profound, right? Mindset and the way you view things matters. It wasn't the worst call ever, it was the worst possible outcome. Imagine how much more we could all learn and achieve if our mindset was somewhat like that. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know if you've read this book or what you're currently reading. Grit by Angela.